Hello, everybody, and welcome. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel. I'm the lead pastor of Encounter Church, and we're really glad that you are worshiping with us today online. We are towards the end of a series that we've been working on for the last several weeks called Summer Fruit. And the idea of Summer Fruit was summer, and in summer you eat fruit, but the main idea of the series is this passage that you find in the letter to the Galatians, one of the letters of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes. And in this letter, he lists these 9 character traits or character qualities. And he calls them the fruit of the Spirit. He says that when the Holy Spirit is in your life, when you're walking with God, when you're following Jesus, you change in many ways. Like the whole point of being a follower of Jesus is that we become people that look like Jesus. And I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, what does it mean to look like Jesus? Like Jesus have never had my job, Jesus never had my kids, so how would Jesus act in my situation? And the answer of the Bible is actually this passage. It's like, well, to live like Jesus, to look like Jesus means to display these 9 character traits, 9 character qualities. This is the fruit, the thing that God does when we walk with him. And we've been kind of like making our way through this. It's just 2 verses, Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. Last several weeks, we've been making our way through verse 22. And we're finally today getting to verse 23. I'm just going to read the passage to you this morning. This is Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, which is another word for patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. And today we'll look at the first word in verse 23, gentleness. So that's the text for today. When I must have been 3 or 4 years old. I'll be honest, I don't remember this. It's just kind of like the lore of my family that sort of has been passed on to me. When I was a little boy, in my house, my parents had this big bookcase, and it was one of those old school bookcases that has kind of like these little doors, and they were glass doors. It was like a wooden bookcase, and then this glass doors that went all the way up, and at some point I'm playing with it, and the book is kind of like standing like behind our dining room table. So, and I'm just playing around like a little kid to do, and I somehow managed to tip over the bookcase, and the bookcase falls over me. But because I'm between, the dining room table and the wall, the bookcase falls over me and falls on the dining room table, kind of like as a triangle, and I'm like in there, sandwiched in between those 2 things. It doesn't touch me, but because it's glass, the glass shatters, and I'm just covered in glass head to toe. And in the house, it's my mom and kind of like, call my nana. It's like this lady that used to take care of me, and it's just the 2 of them. And my mom kind of like has this moment of panic, and my nana says like, no, don't worry, it's okay. And very gently, little by little, they start taking every single shard of glass from my hair, from my face, from my arms. Now that we have our boy Jack, and he's 9 months old. He doesn't walk yet, and trying to change his diaper is like trying to defuse a bomb. It's just like impossible because of how much he squirms and he moves. I cannot imagine the amount of patience and gentleness that it took to take all these shards of glass, because apparently like the legend is like nothing happened to me. Like there was not a single cut. It just this crazy thing that could have gone way worse, but it didn't. And whenever I hear the word gentleness, I think about that story. I think about, in certain circumstances, there's situations, the importance that it has to be gentle and to take, treat things with care. And thinking about that and thinking about this week's topic, and I think it's important because I feel like gentleness is one of those words that, because of how we use it currently, I think it's a lot of times easy to dismiss its importance. Like some of us think that, it only applies to certain people. Like if your personality is the type of personality that's gentle, then of course you should be gentle. But if I'm not like that, then I shouldn't be expect to display gentle. Or even worse, like some people actually think that that gentleness can be a bad thing, right? For some people, gentleness sounds more like wimpiness, right? Like it's a person that's not assertive, or that's very quiet, or like too sensitive to other people's feelings and doesn't care about their own feelings or needs, and doesn't lead to any conflict. And because of that, certain people that the gentleness just doesn't sound not only not appealing, but actually sounds like a bad thing. Like if you have a certain vision of what masculinity ought to look like, if you think masculinity is about strength and power and asserting yourself over others, and gentleness sounds like a bad thing. Or for some people, gentleness sounds like that's a type of attitude that leads people being taken advantage of. Maybe, and this is important to consider, like maybe you've been in some sort of abusive situation, and the idea of being gentle kind of like scares you, because that sounds like the recipe for experiencing more abuse, right? And one of the things that we've been learning through this series is that every one of these character attributes, there's this version of understanding of that word that we have in the world. But when we turn to the scriptures, when we look at, how the Old Testament treats these words, how the New Testament treats these words, a lot of times we see that there's like a little bit of a redefinition of what this means. That the writers of the Bible had this different, more profound idea of what this character, traits might be. And the same is true, by the way, for gentleness. In the New Testament, in the Greek, where which is the language in which the letter to Galatians is written, the word for gentleness is the word prautes. And the word prautes has a couple different meanings. Like if you look it up in the dictionary, it can mean something like, translates as gentleness. It also can translate as meekness, or it can translate as humility. And this word is in turn the translation of an older Hebrew word called anai. And anai is a much more broader word. Like if you remember some of the things we're saying, it's like how the Hebrew language is a little bit different. And in that, in the Hebrew language, gentleness can mean a number of different things, from like meekness and humility. Even though it can also mean to be poor, to be afflicted. It's like this very broad word that has a lot of different meanings. And I think that's interesting because, you will see in the Bible that God himself uses this term of anai, or this term of proud, this term of gentleness, to describe himself. You have to even see Jesus talking about that. Jesus, one of the first things he says is that he is meek and humble in heart. Actually, I want to read you the passage where he says this in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, and I want to read you the newest translation that we use, which is the latest version of the New International Version. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." If you maybe memorize this verse from the earlier New International Version translation, you would have seen that they didn't use the word gentle, they would use the word meek. These two words are sort of interchangeable. They're synonymous. And, I find that interesting because, this idea of meekness is this incredibly fascinating concept, right? Like if you think about somebody that is meek, you usually think about somebody that's maybe shy, or that's not too assertive. Maybe you use a word like somebody that's tame. And some people are like that, naturally. And, for example, me, in spite of the fact that I'm very comfortable talking in front of a crowd, I'm actually when I'm with strangers, I'm a very, very shy, kind of meek person. I just want to get to a corner. I don't want anybody to talk to me. I don't want to talk to anybody because I get very nervous and very shy. In those settings, if you don't know me, you could think that I'm meek, right? But that's a personality trait, right? Like some people have certain personality traits, and some people don't. And we hear the idea of gentleness. We think, well, that's one that doesn't apply to me. Or we think that meekness means weakness. That to be meek means to be a pushover, or somebody has no self-confidence and that lets others take advantage of them, and that doesn't sound like a good thing to be. But the fascinating thing about it is that meekness actually isn't that. If you remember how I said, that one of the terms that we use for meekness is kind of somebody being tame. Well, there's a reason for that, because, one of the Greek, connotations of the word for meekness or for gentleness is actually this idea of taming animals, like horses. And the idea of taming an animal is to get them to control their strength, right? Like a horse has all this speed and all this strength, and you need to be able to have a horse that, won't just run off every time, they're on the open. They won't just, attack anybody or lose or control anybody. But taming is training them to kind of like hone in their strength or controlling their strength, to know when to do something and when not to do something. And that kind of like gets at the core of what gentleness is. Gentleness or meekness, as we're looking at, it's actually not weakness. It's strength under control. If you remember that Matthew passage we just read, that Jesus, who is the Son of God, right? He says that he's meek and that he's gentle and humble in heart. This is the same Jesus that the Bible says from whom everything was created, and that everything was created for him and by him, who God has exalted above anyone else, who sits at the right hand of the Father, who's all the power and all the authority. That Jesus is the same Jesus that says that he's gentle and humble in heart. How can Jesus be gentle? How can Jesus be meek? And well, if you think about it, like the whole of the incarnation, Jesus coming into earth is actually, I would argue, an exercise in meekness. Like God comes down as a baby and he grows up in poverty, and he's announced to shepherds, and pretty much he lives as this wandering homeless man during his ministry. The Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians, this very famous passage in Philippians chapter 2 says about Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And what he's saying is this fascinating, the tension of things in Jesus. That Jesus is God, has all this power and majesty and glory. And somehow when God steps into human history through Jesus, that power and the majesty and the glory are there, but they're kind of like tamed down. The language is like he humbles himself. And the reason why he does that is, we're reading the Bible, is actually that if he doesn't do that, we would be there. Like there's this passage in the Old Testament where Moses wants to see God's glory, and Moses has the gumption to say, God, now show me your glory. And God says to him, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. And I don't think the guy is saying, if I show you my face, I have to kill. He's like, you can't handle my glory. You're a puny human being. If I show you my glory, you will fall dead on the spot. And I think it's equivalent of if you get too close to the sun is not angry at you. The sun is not trying to kill you. You just can't handle the heat. And the same thing is true with the glory of God. Like God is being so majestic and so powerful that we can only get so close to him, except with Jesus. Because in Jesus, God himself walks the earth like a human that you can talk to, like a human that you can touch, like a human that you can share a meal with. Like God is sort of holding back his power out of love for us so that we can be in a relationship. One of the things I've been learning, as a new dad, is that I need to treat Jack with gentleness, right? And it's like I'm harsh with him, but even at the beginning when I was picking him up, I was afraid I was gonna drop him, and making sure that I'm grabbing, when I'm picking him up, making sure that I'm having his neck so he hasn't, all these sorts of things that I'm doing, right? There's all this gentleness that comes of my treatment with Jack. And I'm certainly stronger than how I move. I need to control my strength out of love for Jack so we can be in relationship together. And that is the type of gentleness that the Apostle Paul says in this passage in Galatians the Holy Spirit can produce in us. Now, I think there's two important things to know and dwell if this is true. What the first thing is that one of the keys for a fruit of the Spirit to be produced in our life Is our understanding of how that fruit of the Spirit, or that quality, the character trait, is present in God. And the question then becomes, do we see God as a gentle God? Because I think a lot of us don't, for a number of reasons. Maybe for you it's past trauma, like you've experienced profound disappointment and hurt and pain, and like life has been anything but gentle to you. And it's so hard to imagine that God could be gentle. Maybe you've had bad experiences with people that were supposed to be gentle to you and they weren't. Parents, friends, spouses. And because you have experienced harshness from them, it's so hard for you to relate to God as a God of gentleness. And part of how God changes our mentality of this, one is through Jesus Christ. As I told you, like, Jesus is the ultimate demonstration of the gentleness of God. Jesus is the gentleness of God. That when we come to see, okay, the incarnation, Jesus coming into the world, Jesus becoming a human being, is God actually restraining his power and his strength just so that we can have a better interaction, that we can get to see one another face to face and get to know each other. That is a demonstration of gentleness. But I would argue that another part of that is that a lot of us don't allow for God to interact with us in a way that is gentle. And what I mean by that is that for a lot of us, our experience with God is limited to either, going to church on Sundays, maybe saying a short prayer here and there, maybe you read like a verse of the day type deal, and that's the extent of your experience with God. Maybe for you, it's like you like to listen to podcasts or like worship music, and that's great. All that's great, right? Like I grew up, for example, in the charismatic movement. And in the charismatic movement, like our most of our interactions with God were supposed to be these big, emotional, huge static moments, right? Like you had to have the music pumping and everybody had to be like super expressive. And like that's kind of like where you felt like the power of God, the presence of God was. And I actually think that it's partially true. Like God can manifest himself in all of those settings, and all those things are important. But I think that part of the problem of why we don't see God as gentle is because we're never in a setting where like there's enough time and space and quietness for us to notice how gentle God can be. There's this fascinating passage in the book of First Kings, the story of Prophet Elijah. Prophet Elijah is on the run for his life, and he has this encounter with God, and God tells him that he's going to meet with him. I just want to read you a couple of verses. First Kings chapter 19, verse 11. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Do you notice that God is actually in the gentle whisper? There's the earthquake and there's the world, all these things, and God is in the gentle whisper. And I think that a lot of times that can also be true in our lives. The part of the reason why we're not hearing from God is because we're expecting God to be in the big, like you're expecting God to meet you sometimes, through in your terms, like in the worship song that you're listening to at the time when you pray like the quick prayer, or maybe you show up on Sunday and my message has to have all the answers to the problems in your life, and that's how God needs to speak to you. And a lot of times God is waiting for us to be quiet enough, to be silent enough, and in a gentle whisper speak to us. And when that happens, all of a sudden we have experienced now what? The gentleness of God. For me, the best practice for that is silence and solitude. We've talked about that before. Silence and solitude is kind of like an extension of prayer, right? It's like Jesus talks a lot about like retreating to the lonely places, that we don't only pray in public, we don't only pray like around our table for our meals, but that we seek moments to be by ourselves in the quiet with nobody around and just be quiet with God. And a lot of times that means that part of our prayer is not just talking, but a lot of times it's just being there and sitting in the quiet. And there's something that happens in those moments that opens our heart to what God has to say. And maybe what we're missing is those experiences of the gentleness of God. And the thing is that when we experience that gentleness of God, well, all of a sudden, we can start also displaying gentleness towards other people. I've been thinking about this, that there's so many people right now that are living Christianity for a number of reasons. And honestly, some of the reasons I kind of I don't blame them for it, right? They've experienced tremendous trauma or pain. They've seen disappointment after disappointment of Christian leaders. They've been rejected by church, all sorts of things. But I think that one of the issues that sometimes drives that is that, Christianity without the gentleness of God can be a very, very harsh, oppressive religion. And what at a time that's been so difficult and so hard that the last thing that we need is this hard, oppressive thing in our lives. And we're not experiencing that gentleness from other Christ followers. We're not experiencing that gentleness from our leaders. And, faith becomes this really heavy thing that we don't know how to carry. And I think that that's what Jesus says in Matthew, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. What Jesus is saying is, let me be gentle to you. And I believe that as much as we see and experience God as this gentle God, we are going to then become gentle people who transmit that gentleness to others. This is why the Apostle Paul says in another place, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. You see, the key to gentleness is our love for one another, which flows out of our love for God. When I'm gentle with my son, when I pick him up and trying to just exert the right amount of strength, when I left him, when everything I do, the gentleness I have with my son, the reason number one why I do that is because I don't want to hurt my son, because I love my son. And that might seem incredibly, obvious and self-explanatory. But I think that there's a key there, that I control my strength. I control the tone of my voice. I control the amount of force I use in a manner that's directly proportional to my care and how much I don't want to hurt the person that I'm talking to. I'm saying that because I think that part of the problem is that we miss that sense of care for others recently. Like I've seen that a lot in social media. I talk about social media a lot, not because I'm obsessed with it, because I actually think that that's where a lot of us are living the majority of our lives, particularly during these past few months. And part of what I see is a trend to listen, you need to speak out for yourself. You need to speak your truth. You need to, say what you need. You need to say what you're thinking. And all that is important. I'm stand by. I don't want you to feel judged. But there's a line that's almost like at the expense of, who cares how other people feel? And who cares how other people take it? I'm using the same thing. And the problem for me with that is, when you're putting something in social media is a medium designed for others to interact with. Like the primary target of anything you're posting is other people to read it. So there's a sense in which you are saying that to others, right? But more importantly than that, it's almost like we don't know how to strike the balance without caring for ourselves and, speaking our truth and asking for our needs. And the idea that somehow if we're connected with other people, that we have to be aware of how our words and our actions, when not done or said in a gentle manner, can hurt. And that if we love one another, which is what Paul is saying in Ephesians, then we are going to take care of how we say things, of how we talk to others, of how we interact with them, of how we ask for things, of how we rebuke people sometimes. And it's all done through gentleness. Why? Because it's born out of love. And the key is this idea, right? That when love is at the center of the thing, our main intention is not to hurt the other person. It's actually to restore the relationship, to bring the relationship to a better place. And a lot of us, sometimes we don't want to do that. We actually want to hurt. We actually want to get back at. We actually want to get even. We actually want to say the thing that they know they're not going to like in the way that we know they're not going to like, because that will show them, right? And now they're going to feel how I feel, and somehow that'd be cathartic to me. But Jesus says, well, learn from me, and I'm gentle, and I'm humble in heart. I don't interact with you in a way that would intentionally hurt you. That's what he's saying when he says that he's gentle. And I think that when we understand how we've been treated by God through Jesus, that God restrains himself to care for us, that he can like controls his power and his majesty so we can have a relationship, that starts shaping who we are and how we relate to others. And as much as we expose ourselves to the gentleness of God, to be trained by gentleness by God, we're going to start becoming gentle with other people, because that's how we've been loved. It's interesting that in one of the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are the meek, he says, because they will inherit the earth. And I think what Jesus is saying is, listen, at the end of the day, you may think that strength always wins. You may think that just exercising power always wins. And that's what it may look like in the world right now. But at the end of the day, you know who's going to inherit the earth? The gentle ones. The gentleness is going to win the day. That's like the grain of the universe. The way the universe is supposed to work is we're as being gentle on earth. So my invitation to you today is that they will come to God. Like Jesus says, come to me. And you're carrying the burden. You may carry the burden of trying to bear with this faith that might seem so harsh. But maybe it's because you haven't experienced my gentleness. And maybe it's hard for you to think about how to be gentle with one another. And that's because you haven't let me be gentle to you. And Jesus maybe says to us, let me be gentle to you. Get away with me in the silence, in the quiet place, and find rest for your souls. And that's my prayer for us today. Grace and peace.